Welcome, my name is Amanda Lewis. I'm the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy and on the faculty in Sociology and African American Studies. I'm super excited today to be having the first session in a new series that we are doing collaboratively with the Institute on Policy and Civic Engagement and the Institute on Government and Public Affairs, two other policy kind of units on campus. We were talking for a while about all of our different work to try to increase the impact of all the important research that you're doing out in the world, and realizing that a lot of the skill sets necessary to get our work out there aren't always things that we learn along the way. So we have these very practical workshops. We have 3 scheduled for this year, and the goal is to have a different 3 next year and then keep this going alternating. We are going to tape them all and make them available online. So if you have colleagues who couldn't make it today but want to have access to the information and the insights of our esteemed panel, please direct them there, and we'll send out information about that when it's available. I want to talk just briefly about what we mean by policy. And this isn't a shared definition by all the different units involved, but just to give you a sense that we are thinking about policy in kind of a big umbrella kind of way. It includes not only the specific work we might do to help legislators think about how to change rules or set new laws and that sort of thing, but also a range of different activities that we can engage in to shape how we understand social issues, to map the specific kinds of changes in the world that we can imagine that might address the challenges that we describe, and or working with community organizations, practitioners, activists, and others to actually put knowledge to use in some way. And we have lots of examples of different kinds of research and work that we're all doing. If you have suggestions for specific things that you think we need to cover that aren't on the first 3, we have a long list, but we are always open to more suggestions. The next 2 for this series, there's a session on engaging in thought leadership and writing for a public audience. That will be on November 10th. This is the only one that will be in a different location. It'll be at the Great Cities Institute in the College of Urban Planning and Public Administration, which is on Peoria and Buren. And then on January 26th, we'll have a session on use of new media, strategies and platforms. Obviously, all of us are encouraged to think about tweeting and other things. Obviously, I'm not the biggest user of new media. But there's lots of challenges involved and things that we need to think about along the way. And lastly, I wanted to plug 2 other things that IRRPP is doing coming up. We have a new lecture series we started last year on embodied inequalities, unpacking the impact of race and racism on health. And we're very excited to have Jonathan Metzl coming in on October 19th. He's giving a talk on structural competency, a new paradigm for addressing race and racism in medicine. We have another panel in November looking at trauma and health, and specifically looking at the traumas involved in some of the consequences of race and policing, and a great panel of activists and some survivors and some public health folks involved in that. I could plug more, but otherwise I'll just tell you to go to the IRRPP and IGPA and IPSI websites. But now I'm going to let Yvonne Arenas, who is the Associate Director of IRRPP, moderate the panel and also introduce our esteemed colleagues here.
And welcome everyone, and as moderator it is my honor to introduce our 4 distinguished panelists in the order that they're going to speak. Pauline Lipman is Professor of Educational Policy Studies and Director of the Collaborative for Equity and Justice in Education at UIC. Dr. Lipman's commitment to research and activism for social justice in education is visible in her ongoing work with Teachers for Social Justice, her collaboration with the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization's Journey for Justice campaign, and in her current work on a community research project documenting the effects of school closings. It's great to have you here. Beth Richie is Professor of African American Studies and Criminology, Law, and Justice at UIC. Dr. Richie's scholarly and activist work on how race reflects African American women's experience of violence and incarceration played an important role in her leadership of IRRPP as former director, for organizing work with other radical feminists of color to found Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, and her ongoing work with the Prison Neighborhood Arts Project. Jenny Hebert-Beirne is Assistant Professor in Community Health Sciences at the School of Public Health at UIC. Dr. Hebert-Beirne researches and practices community-based approaches to improve health equity and social justice for low-income and oppressed populations. She has done this work in nonprofits, is Vice President of Research for the Women's Health Foundation, and a Senior Health Planner and Policy Analyst for the Chicago Department of Public Health, but also in her ongoing long-time collaborative work with the Little Village Community Health Assessment. Welcome. Phoenix Matthews is Professor and Clinical Psychologist in the Department of Health System Science at the College of Nursing at UIC. Dr. Matthews is known for her health disparities research with underserved populations around cancer risk reduction. At IRRPP, we also know Dr. Matthews for her collaborative work with the Pride Action Tank, which is doing research, advocacy, and action to support the passage of public policy regarding mandatory conversion of gendered, single-stall restrooms to gender-neutral restrooms in Chicago. Welcome. So before hearing from our speakers, I want to draw your attention to 3 key principles that emerged from last year's Engaged Research Workshop, simply because these have formed the groundwork for discussions about this event. First, how is it that we might have equitable partnerships and collaborations? How do we value and bring community knowledge and expertise and academic knowledge and expertise together through a collaborative relationship? Also, how do we think about community priorities? How might we have research and outcomes driven by community identified needs? And finally, how do we think about action or policy change? How is the knowledge created by this research used to transform and tackle urgent community needs? How can it have programmatic and policy outcomes? So we've sent out questions to our distinguished panelists, asking them to reflect on the challenges they've faced realizing these principles in their work with community members. We've asked them to share the concrete practices they've used to create positive community university research collaborations. As for the format, each is going to have approximately 12 minutes to present, and then we're going to open up the floor in the last 30 minutes for them to address questions you have. So as you listen, please do write down any questions you have. We ask that you keep them as brief as possible so that they can answer and reflect on as many as they have a chance to. And so with that, if we can welcome and turn over the floor to Dr. Lipman. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, IRRPP. I just want to acknowledge all the activist scholars that are actually in the room, as well as on the panel. And I really appreciate trying to lift up activist scholarship, genuine collaborations with communities as real work that the university needs to be doing, especially a public university where the resources need to be actually benefit the communities. So thanks a lot for inviting me. I want to say that the work that I'm going to talk about has been done through the Collaborative for Equity and Justice in Education, or SEEGE. And that's a collaboration. So I'm speaking, but the voice that I'm speaking from is not just my own. I'm really speaking from the sort of our collective experience and our collective wisdom. And in particular, I want to acknowledge Rhoda Ray Gutierrez, who's not here, who's my co-conspirator in SEEGE. And Rhoda and I wrote an article recently on trying to struggle over some of the dilemmas in activist scholarship. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today really comes from our collective thinking. So Rhoda actually should be here as well. So what we do is, with organized communities, we want to produce knowledge that shifts the dominant neoliberal policy discourse, exposes the racism inherent in neoliberal policies, and supports and lifts up community solutions and supports education justice struggles. So our research is policy focused. In the research that we're doing, we're operating out of our specific context here in Chicago, although we do work with hosts nationally too. But in the research we do, communities are contesting the state. And so they're pushing back against policies of the state, and they're also proposing policies that come from the ground, from the experiences of parents and teachers and communities. And what we understand and what they understand is that research is just one tactic in a multitude of tactics that folks are using. So in our case, we are participants as well as researchers. We actually, both Rhoda and I, and other people who've been involved in SEEGE, were already organizing against Chicago's neoliberal policies before we started doing this kind of research. So it's not like we, thought, oh, maybe we should do some research. It's actually people said, we need research. And can we work together to do research? So we are both activists and we're researchers together. And our collaborations come out of that. Some of our projects are that we've done analyses of school district policies, like school closings, charter school expansion. Federico actually produced a siege report that's related to the charter school issue. Top-down governance. We've looked at the relationship between education policy, gentrification, race, and poverty in the city. We've looked at U.S. government policy regarding youth on a national basis, and that was for a national campaign that was rooted from folks in Chicago. We do substantive reports, but we also do short policy briefs. Our collaborations span a range between community organizations, teachers, and parents. So the work that we do is coordinated with and initiated with the communities that we're actually in solidarity with. We're both part of coalitions. I'm part of Teachers for Social Justice. Rhoda is part of Parents for Teachers. And so when we're doing this work, we're also the people who stepped out in front of the board and who got thrown out of board meetings and all the rest of that. Went to a lot of meetings and strategized. We do strive for full collaboration, but in the real world, that means that, for us anyway, that's meant different kinds of things. People in communities don't have time to develop research methods necessarily and go out and do certain kinds of research. Things are time sensitive. They're gonna close 20 schools in 6 weeks, and we just found out about it. And we need to look at the relationship between that and gentrification. So our collaborations are the work that we do is framed in collaboration with community organizations. We work with them to gather data. We sometimes, we share drafts and people comment on them, but it's not like we're just all doing the same thing side by side. Our research is action-oriented, but that does not mean that we necessarily expect results tomorrow. We're engaged in protracted struggles, and so we're hoping that the work that we do actually contributes to action over time in terms of protracted struggles. And the other thing is that, of course, we have a position. We're working from a position, but we also need to understand that our research needs to be more rigorous. That does not absolve us from doing rigorous research because we have a position, for example, in school closings. It actually has to be more rigorous because the stakes are much higher than whether your article gets rejected by a journal, for example. People's lives actually depend on it. So it's, we have to bring together our political stance and rigorous research. So our principles are, aligned with actually these principles up here, but I just want to briefly mention them, and then I want to talk about some dilemmas. So the first one is collaborative research and knowledge production, and that's actually, very well stated in the IRRPP principles that you developed. That, there's multiple forms of knowledge, and that we value and the knowledge that comes from those people who are actually experiencing the effects of unjust policies. The second one is organizing as everyday life. Research, we're trying to do research that serves social struggle and is guided by organizing, not building our careers. And I want to quote Laura Pulido, who says, we are part of a community of struggle, rather than as the academic who occasionally drops in. We too have a stake. 3, desire-based over damage-centered research. So here we're trying to follow the lead of Eve Tuck, who warns us that a lot of well-meaning research by those who are critical of structural inequalities actually depicts communities as broken and or irreparably damaged by the structures of oppression that we face. And Tuck calls for, instead, a desire-based research framework that looks to community wisdom for solutions and new visions and fosters hope. The fourth is is organizing as fundamental to social change. So we think that we know that research can be an important tool for social change, but when it's linked to organizing. The problem is actually not that policymakers are unenlightened, and if we simply give them information, that they'll do something different. They actually have, this is about power, and so the research is just one aspect. Organizing is fundamental. So I have a few minutes left, and I want to talk about 3 dilemmas, if I can get through them. The first one is how to negotiate activism and research credibility. So our experience has been that our activism sometimes clouds the legitimacy of what is in fact rigorous research that we do with policymakers and with the media. And we had some direct experiences with that really kind of took us back and made us think about this some more. And so then we went into a mode for a while where I didn't speak at any more press conferences. I wore sunglasses at rallies. We presented our reports wearing our suits. I actually don't have a suit, but something like that, et cetera. And then we just kind of asked ourselves, who are we fooling, you know? And so we just don't fit the mold of this statistics-wielding objective researcher. So we actually had to look back to feminist researchers again to remind ourselves that, situated knowledge is more, quote, insightful, complete, and accountable. As Hale says that, as Hale says that the battle against hegemonic positive objectivity is that we try to re-articulate it as positioned objectivity. So we want to claim that our work is more objective and more insightful and more complete because we are actually engaged in it, because over 10 or 12 years, we've talked to hundreds of people. We've seen the effects of these policies in a way that just dropping it as a researcher would not tell us. The second dilemma is, and so we said, well, so what if we said that we've participated in community meetings, we've been involved in the struggle, and we see firsthand the harm that market-driven education policies cause. What if we claim that in our research over the last 10 years, we've spoken to many people, and they've talked about the harm? What if we say that in our research, we find that parents and caregivers have a vision for high-quality education for their children, that they have alternative proposals to market-based reforms, and that we understand this because of our involvement. The second dilemma is how not to contribute to the hegemony of positivism. So education is everything in the policy world about the tyranny of test scores. And test scores are being used, of course, to promote markets, to close schools, et cetera. And they are the sort of gold standard of what counts as evidence. And we write in our academic work and in our reports, actually, whole critiques of why things like test scores, graduation rates don't really tell us what's happening in schools. And they actually obscure inequalities and injustices and racial oppression. Yet, when we wrote our report for the coalition that's fighting for an elected school board, we actually did 2 reports on Chicago's appointed board and why we need an elected board. We used the NAEP scores, the National Assessment of Education Progress, which is sort of a gold standard, which show that under the appointed board, that racial gaps in academic achievement and graduation rates and dropout rates have actually stayed the same or increased despite this. So here we are, you know, walking on 2 feet or something like that, trying to walk on 2 feet. Okay, so I have to conclude. So what we draw on is the idea, so what we're trying to draw on is the idea of strategic duality, which is what Hale talks about. The positive, that these kinds of measures can have subversive potential if they advance struggles and if they're coupled with a critique of them and also advance qualitative knowledge. And I'll just name the third dilemma because I'm out of time. The third dilemma is, how do we leverage the authority of the university, which we carry the authority of the university, we are the quote-unquote experts, that's the term that we're put on our backs or whatever. How do we leverage the authority of the university to support community struggles and lift up community knowledge and validate and legitimate community knowledge at the same time? And I don't want to go into how we dealt with it because I'm out of time.
Thanks, Pauline. I was taking notes on what you said. Oh, sure. As long as you don't ask me to do a PowerPoint, which I didn't prepare for. So I was saying thanks to Pauline for your presentation, but also your work, and for naming some of the dilemmas. I think there's going to be lots of overlap. I'm really happy and proud to be on the panel with my colleagues, and of course appreciative to IRRPP for this opportunity to sort of make real something that I know lots of people in our community have wanted for a long time, which is how to make policies sort of stand as something we can hold on to, right? We can talk about with some fluency. So thank you. Thanks, Amanda, Yvonne. So my work focuses on mass incarceration, on the prison industrial complex, on carceral feminism, prison abolition, really the ways that race and sexuality and class and age, income, become sites of vulnerability to the long reach of the carceral state, of the prison nation. And I really focus my work on the place, like the buildings and the people in the buildings, but more on the processes by which people get caught up in that mean-spirited system. And in many ways, my work with women, Black women, particularly in low-income communities, took me into prisons. I didn't start thinking about the buildings and the people inside. I thought about the people, but I didn't think about the buildings. It was really following where women were and how they were being caught up, particularly Black women who experienced certain kinds of violence in their communities. Where they ended up is how I ended up in this as the site of my research. It was really following this entrapment of Black, poor women into the criminal legal system that began my spot there. And I say that because I'll talk about the dilemmas later, but doing work with people who are living in cages and incarcerated by not only the buildings, but also the systems that surround the buildings creates lots of dilemmas for me. And in some ways, I almost want to say, I'm so sorry I have to study those places, because in fact, that's kind of what the work is in opposition to. I'm going to talk about 3 projects. The first one is a project that I began a number of years ago with a group called the National Network for Women in Prison. The National Network for Women in Prison is a group that is national, has kind of come together, led by formerly incarcerated women who are trying to change, or first bring awareness to what the issues that women face who are caught up in the criminal legal system, not only incarcerated, but caught up in the system. And then also to figure out what they could do in terms of public policy to try to change that rapid growth of influx. They in particular were interested in figuring out how they could be better advocates for women on the inside, many of whom were in and out. The people who were part of the organization spent time long periods in time, but also were out, but then were often rearrested. So for them, the question of the revolving door of the criminal legal system and the particular ways that race and gender and class influenced that for them was of concern. So I worked with them. They came to me because they knew of my work with a national prison abolition organization called Critical Resistance, and I'll talk a little bit about what we did with the National Network for Women in Prison. The second project that I'm going to talk about is a more recent piece of work I'm doing with the Illinois Justice Authority with support from the Safer Foundation here in Chicago. It's a qualitative project looking at how bond court, or the process of bail, affects family members of people who've been arrested and are detained at the Cook County Jail. And sort of on the surface of this study, it's kind of a project that the Chicago Public Defender's Office wants to do to see how their very vulnerable clients are impacted by arbitrary and often unfair decisions about bail. But more, sort of on closer look at what I was asked to do, it's really to kind of give voice to the family members who are, by extension, caught up in the Cook County Jail process and how bail impacts that. And a way that their voices had something very particular to say about policy in this city, in this county, in this country around bail. The third project, I'll be on sabbatical next semester and I'm going to pick up with research that I started doing a number of years ago that I call Hands to Hold and Room to Dance. And I took that title from a woman who I met in a jail a number of years ago. I met her so outraged by the conditions that she and the people who she was in relationship with in the jail were facing. I walked into the jail one day and saw this sign. Some of you have heard me tell this story. I saw a sign on the wall on a piece of Xerox paper that said, no hand-holding, no commingling, no standing still, and no wearing of men's underwear. And then that was typed, written in hand was, violations will result in placement in the Bing, which is solitary confinement. And I took the sign down. I was in the jail for another reason, not to do research or advocacy. I took the sign down and put it in my bag that I was allowed to carry in at the time, and just sort of kept it with me. And when I talked with the group of women that I was coming to meet with, I was just horrified by this sign. Like, how could this sign exist? It's a longer story of what it all means, but no holding hands. We know what that means about limiting intimacy. No standing still. Well, guards can tell you to stand still or move on at any moment, so you don't really have some option. No commingling means you can't talk to people who you know, isolation. And no wearing of men's underwear meant at any moment that an officer could say, let me see your underwear, and then had the authority to decide whether it was men's underwear or women's underwear, right? So I was horrified by the sign. And the women told me, after I sort of ranted, just like I was about to really go off and do here, that I just really needed to calm down. I need to rethink this. I was already like going to pull my feminist legal authorities to the table, and they said, that's not what we want you to do. That's not what's important to us. What we want you to do is tell the story of how we're surviving. We know those signs are there, but we are holding hands. We are wearing whatever underwear we want, and sometimes we're not wearing underwear, okay? And we're commingling, we're making family. So we want you not to object to the story based on your analysis as a carceral feminist or a prison abolitionist. We want you to tell our story from our own words. And so the project that I'm committed to doing while on sabbatical is the story from their own words. So let me talk then about those three projects in relationship to the principles. In terms of the National Network for Women in Prison, this was an opportunity literally where a group came to me and said, we want you to help us think about how we can be advocates on policies related to our experiences of incarceration, both in the prisons and then what happens to us when we're released. They were interested in knowing what official policies there were. So they sort of had lived under the policy, they'd lived experiences, but they wanted me to do research really about the policies around whether they could or could not get jobs in nail salons, whether or not they could get apartments in public housing, whether or not they could, in fact, get their children back and how they would do that. So they wanted me to be a policy researcher, and then they wanted to take the policy research that I did and describe their real life experience against the policy. They wanted to really say to policymakers, here's what you say, but here's how it really works for us in real time. Sorry, machine. As they were doing that, they realized that what they wanted to become was the advocates that explained the difference between the policies and what the real life experience was. And in order to do that, they wanted to train each other to do things like policy advocacy, community organizing, and leadership development. Leadership development was their term that they used then to describe a curriculum that they asked me to write. I didn't feel like I knew enough about the lived experiences. I could do the policy research, but what they needed to know about advocacy and leadership, I thought really needed to come from them. And so they developed a series of trainings for each other, and I was the recorder, the kind of witness to the work. I wrote down everything they did. I gave some feedback to them, but really more in the form of here's what you did, here's how it worked. We videotaped it, they critiqued it. In the end, it led to a weekend-long training that now is being done all over the country. It's called the Leadership Training Institute for Formerly Incarcerated Women. To date, there have been about 120 women trained. Many of the women got jobs now because they had learned some skills. And what was important about it was that their interpretation of the policy reform that came out of it was not only about here's how an X on your back or a felony disenfranchisement will affect women, but it also said here's how it's linked to persistent poverty, here's how it's linked to unemployment, here's how it's linked to homelessness. They sort of took it to another level. A lot of people have written about this, but their work from their own experience drove that. The bond court work, in a nutshell, is a chance for people who are often most harmed by bond or by bail or were left out of the discussion about the impact of a high bond on a person's ability to actually have a fair legal case. The family members are telling me things that are very different than what prisoners themselves say or what advocates for prisoners or what lawyers say. And I think to the extent that family members now are engaged in the discussion, again, positioning them as experts has been quite important. I can say more about that later. The last one I already forecast, hands to hold and room to dance. This really came as a challenge to me. This was an example of sort of my having to reorder my thinking about what was important and really listen carefully. It took me a minute or two to get convinced that this was more important, that what women wanted was more important than what I felt was sort of my obligation given my politics around this. But it's very clear that the chance to talk about intimacy, education, what really happens on the inside, how people make meaning out of long-term sentences was very important. Two areas of dilemmas. One, prison as a site of research. To even go in and act like something good happens there raises a political challenge for me. And yet I feel like I'm obligated to do that because there are people there who are surviving. Bringing gender into a discussion that usually framed as a racial justice issue has been a dilemma for me. The best thing that I have found is for people to speak for themselves. That's a lot of what the National Network for Women in Prison has done. And then, of course, there's a whole list of dilemmas. I guess I'm going to call them sites of exhaustion, because it is so overwhelming to work inside prisons, to hear people tell stories of suffering and degradation. And then the last thing I'll say, because I have 0 minutes to give a concluding thought, is that for me, in many ways, I feel a lot of tension in these kinds of discussions, because I came to do almost all of this work much more as an activist than a researcher. And I sometimes feel like if I were going to be self-critical, I don't sort of bring enough of the kind of academic obligation that Pauline talked about to my work. I don't present often at academic conferences. I go to activist conferences. I write articles that often are in newsletters, not as much in journals. And I feel in many ways that's because I came to this work not as a researcher, but as an activist. And the challenge, I think, is to figure out how to balance that tension. And I think we usually think of the tension as balanced, that we're too academic. I think sometimes we're out of balance in other kinds of ways. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Jenny Hebert-Beirne, actually not Hebert, but thank you, Yvonne, for giving me my French pronunciation, which if I was more classy, maybe I would use, but we long converted to Hebert. I'm just so happy to be here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that I do from the School of Public Health, and I'm a little afraid that these are going to advance by themselves, so I'm going to keep my finger on the arrow here. So I'm from the School of Public Health. I do a lot of work employing community-based participatory research methods in a community health assessment context. And since I see very few public health people, I'll take a second to define a couple of those things. And I want to talk about the work that I've been doing in Chicago community areas and the path that I came to be engaged in this work. You know, employing these participatory research methods and really trying to involve my students, some of whom are in this room, as partners in this participatory research activity with community-based organizations at the neighborhood level. So I'm a community health scientist. I think in terms of communities, neighborhoods. And I also want to talk a little bit about another thing I'm involved in. I've been pulled into an NIH grant where I'm bringing some community-engaged scholarship to the NIH in terms of women's pelvic and sexual health. And that's super fascinating because it's a group of urogynecologists who don't do a lot of community-engaged research. So a lot of surgeons for whom this is all very new. And so it's been a really interesting learning experience for me having to translate what is community-engaged scholarship. So I want to talk a little bit about from how I came to this, though, before I get started. You know, it's interesting, the speakers in front of me brought this activist identity to this work. I was a practitioner. I worked at the Chicago Department of Public Health for years, and then in nonprofit organizations. And so I came to academia really understanding practice. In public health practice, we do a lot of intervening on communities. And so I had those uncomfortable experiences of bringing a grant to a community and saying, congratulations, we were funded to help you. I also was part of teams that would come into communities and say, we are here because when we look at our surveillance data, you have the worst numbers across the whole city of Chicago. And so I really became uncomfortable with, of course, how inefficient, how inappropriate that kind of outsider coming into communities is. And so that was a really important learning opportunity for me to think about working in partnership with communities, you know, really thinking about what is scholarship. Community-engaged scholarship is really attending to these issues of privilege and power and funding and knowledge and everything that the two previous speakers talked about in terms of whose knowledge, whose evidence is important here. So I want to talk about a couple of things. Actually, I just gave this talk at the NIH, so I couldn't help but throw this slide in here. Because one of the things that is important to acknowledge is this on the far right side, this is community-engaged research. When we think about community-engaged scholarship across the research cycle, community-engaged research is fundamentally different than what we might call traditional research, which happens to be quite positivist in nature, kind of quite top-down. So, and I don't expect you to read through all this slide, but when we think about community-engaged research, even at the level of identifying what is the problem or coming up with a research question or a hypothesis, with community-engaged research, it really needs to come from the community, and that's fundamentally important, but of course rarely happens because of the way that academia is situated with respect to communities. When it comes to study design, data collection, and recruitment, the communities should be leading in those efforts, knowing their communities best, what would be the most feasible, appropriate research design, what would be the recruitment methods that would work the best. And then when it comes to data collection, analysis, and interpretation, this is where, you know, first of all, community partners tend to disengage. This might be the area in which, particularly if they don't have training in research methodology, they might find their role less involved, less important. But it's fundamentally important because what tends to happen is community partners step out and researchers interpret the meaning of the data that came from the community. So I'll give some examples of how we've tried to address these issues across the research cycle. And then lastly, even the way that we talk about dissemination in the research cycle as being last, of course, dissemination ideally happens across the whole research cycle in the form of what we call in public health at least kind of member checking, sharing with the community our emerging findings. Do we have this right? Does this make sense? And a lot of people are using this language of knowledge translation rather than dissemination to kind of put a more reciprocal meaning to this thing that tends to be one way and tends to be dissemination in the terms of academic publications and presentations rather than the kinds of dissemination that contribute to social change and action. So if we think about community engaged research models, I aspire to be on this shared leadership end. You know, when we talk about community engaged scholarship, there's a lot of examples of community advisory boards that may consult or give advice, but we typically in public health are really trying to work towards having co-investigators and sharing our inquiry, and I have hopefully some examples of how we're trying to do that. So I want to share some examples of work we've been doing in Little Village and now in North Lawndale, so we're referring to this more of the greater Lawndale area. But we've been working with community-based organizations in Little Village on this academic community, participatory, iterative, community-tailored, student-engaged, multidisciplinary effort to produce knowledge. And we struggled, we even came up with that term in a participatory way because we wanted to describe what we're doing. We're interested in using community health assessment, but in this participatory, engaged way. And a community health assessment is exactly what you think it is. It's identifying the needs and the assets of a community in order to identify an intervention that will improve health. But in public health, you know, we have long been relying on surveillance data to tell us about people's health. And in public health, that's quite deficit-oriented data on the individual level. And it tells us a lot about disease and death, but it doesn't tell us about the inner workings of a community. It doesn't tell us about assets, resiliency, those things that we need to know to make social change. And we actually got involved in Little Village because one of the community-based organizations reached out to us and said, you know, we think we have a problem, we'd like some academic partnership. And having done this work for so long and having never received that phone call, I said, whatever you want to do. And they were very interested in, and I probably don't have time for this story, but I think back on it a lot. It was an organization that reached out and said, you know, we think that our infant mortality rate is increasing in Little Village. And having worked for the public health department for a long time and spending a lot of time on, I'm on my third slide and I have 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna go really fast. Spending a lot of time on data at the community level across the city of Chicago, Little Village has the lowest rates of infant mortality. It always has. It's kind of part of the Mexican health paradox, which is there's something about immigrant communities that lead to positive health outcomes. But instead of saying that can't possibly be true, let's work on something else, that's where we started. And we unpacked infant death data, and then we moved on to talking about where are your concerns about infant death and on to maternal health. And we've used this iterative research agenda that has led us now to start talking more about social determinants of health, which is what I would like to talk about from the beginning, because I'm a community health scientist who brings some social determinants of health thinking. So we're talking about issues of work and precarious work at the community level. So real quickly, it's an engaged research effort. The iterative nature is really important, and we're really focused on the conditions in which people live and their opportunities to be healthy, rather than on this deficit-oriented data. We've moved into North Lawndale, both because our data started pointing us in that direction. There's some tension. I'm sorry that it's moving forward. I'm not exactly sure what to do about that. Both because community members were telling us they wanted to work more in partnership with North Lawndale that shares similar but different issues with respect to health and social determinants of health. And also because we got funding. And this is one of the major problems, is that when you have funding, you have to address the fact that academic partners are not funded equitably to community partners. And it's a real problem, and it's basically built into our structures and our systems at academic institutions, that inequity in pay. So real quickly, I want to talk about these three principles in engaged scholarship: this facilitating equitable partnership, building on community priorities, and action. So we strive towards equitable partnership all the time. Some of the ways that we do this, and this is very much driven by our partners, is to create spaces in which we can learn together and produce shared knowledge rather than bringing academic knowledge in and presuming that academic knowledge trumps community knowledge, as some of my colleagues were saying. So these transformative community spaces, some examples of them are we use Pláticas de Salud, so health chats to share our emerging findings. That's kind of a common effort that people engage in this kind of community scholarship. But one of the most interesting ones is we started to, as we looked at our data from our community health assessment, from interviews, from focus groups, from a community health survey, from all the data we get from the health department, one of the things our partners told us is that we weren't really capturing what is the story of Little Village. We weren't really getting the story. We were kind of interpreting our own meaning of the data. And that led us to a partnership with StoryCorps in the collection of people's stories in Little Village. And one really interesting learning opportunity, I think I have some pictures from our listening events. It's one of our listening events in North Lawndale, is that when we started collecting the stories, we started applying some of our traditional research methodologies to the story. I'm mostly a qualitative researcher, and some of my colleagues in the room were also involved in this. We started applying some qualitative data analysis strategies to the stories, which we thought might be an appropriate way to examine the data and use this mixed method strategy to bring in stories with our other kinds of quantitative data. And our community partners said, you know, in a lot of ways, you're just bringing this more positivist, reductionist strategies to our stories. And we'd rather you share our stories and have the stories produce a conversation, a dialogue, and that dialogue then became our data. So that's one of a million things that we've learned about this. We've also engaged in member checking, as I said, through Podcast de Salud. Another example of our community spaces that we've created is we've created these think tanks to engage in data analysis, both our qualitative data analysis and our quantitative data analysis of our community health survey. And I could probably spend, for sure, another 12 minutes just talking about what we've learned from this. So just real quickly, our community priorities, one of the ways that we make sure we're still operating within the confines of what the community finds as its health priorities is that the community members, our partners, really lead our inquiry, and this includes making sure that they're orienting us to their neighborhoods, their place, and their stories through the use of community tours, which we do for our new students who are getting involved, and also presenting with us at academic conferences. And I think I'm out of time. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm a little bit of a strange bird with this panel because I'm coming to you from the position of community. And let me talk to you specifically about the community that I'm representing. I belong to a group of people who would just like to pee in peace. All right? And so this is where this project emanates from. We are the community group that I represent, Chicago Restroom Access Project. And this is derived from the community. In my inbox one day, a message came from a trans brother and said, look at this fantastic work that's happening around the country on initiatives that are changing through legislative policies at the local level, the signage around single-stalled restrooms. So any stall that's gendered in Philadelphia and some other cities is now being converted through legislative acts to gender neutral. Let's do this. I'm like, oh, I've got my own scientist. I can't be involved in this. I gotta do this. La, la, la. And then one day I spent, and I kid you not, I spent 30 minutes trying to figure out where I could pee in peace, and still had to end up making a drive across town just to go home because I was tired of the effort. And then that inbox note came back to me, and I thought, oh, yeah, this is something that I need to take on. It has to be separate from my research. I'm not going to talk to you about my research at all. I'm going to talk to you about my role as a member of this collaborative. So, in the fall of last year, a lot of us got tired of not being able to pee appropriately, and then we brought together a group of community stakeholders, and we formed CRAP. And CRAP is a part of the Pride Action Tank, and there were a lot of forces of nature. Some people said it was some astrological things lining up, but during this period of time, some phenomenal things have happened. This is something that its time had come, and there were several pockets of activism that were happening around the city that we were able to bring into a single place under this larger rubric of the Pride Action Tank that has really been synergistic and really dynamic. So in response to these national policy change, a group of us got together to try to, here in Chicago, pass legislation that was similar to what we were seeing around the country. All right? Easy enough, right? I'll tell you the story about that though. So in thinking about the questions that were put before us, I'd like to talk to you about it in terms of what we have been experiencing, problems that we've been encountering, and what we've been trying to do in the moment to keep the work moving forward. And I think I'll touch on each of the three priority areas as we go along. So let me talk to you a little bit about the background. We know from lots and lots of research that trans, identified, and gender nonconforming people remained a highly stigmatized group. One of the things that happens is that there are public policies in place that exacerbate the negative consequences of people's day-to-day lives, types of things that they experience. Several folks around the country are trying to do some work around this, all right? So I am a psychologist, health psychologist, so let me contextualize why this really does fall into an area that public health folks, city planners, and other folks, research pencil head types, would be interested in. Is that we know that discrimination based on marginalized social identities are associated with health disparities. That's sort of my area of research, but I'm staying away from that because I'm community here. But when it comes specifically to the experiences of trans-identified folks, is that this experience of holding it, driving around town, trying to figure out a place to pee in peace, has health consequences. There are documented cases of urinary tract infections, dehydrations, folks who have become physically ill because of restroom policies. Okay, so this, the needs of community, the experiences of community happen in the larger social context, and I'll show you some research that says that this has implications for people's mental and physical health. Okay? So although policies are starting to change across the country, there is still a great deal of opposition to gender-neutral restroom policies. So there's a recent survey that came out that said half of folks in the country said that transgender people should not be able to choose their bathroom of their choice, right? There are these regressive, reactionary legislative policies that are being put on the ballots. And even in places where there are positive bills put in place, there is, again, opposition to that, and so we're still in a stalemate, much in the same way that we were with the Defense of Marriage Act. When states started to make known that they were willing to legalize same-sex marriages, there were lots of regressive types of policies that were put in place that resulted in about a 15-year sort of lag between those initial efforts and marriage equality. These types of legislative approaches have negative impacts on people and on LGBT's mental health experiences. So there was a brilliant study that was done that looked at national data on mental and physical health pre and post DOMA. And those states where these DOMA policies were put in place, LGBT folks living in those communities had an increase of anxiety disorders, substance use, and just sort of an overall reduction in personal well-being. So we are about to see a replication on a national level of the type of pushback that we saw with DOMA around transgender access legislation. What we're trying to do is understand from a policy perspective, how do we build community coalition to get those policies in place here in Chicago in a way that they are ironclad, right? But also includes this sensitivity to the need to protect the most vulnerable in the communities against the blowback, the inevitable blowback that will take place. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the panel. So our first thing that we discovered in this work is that we needed to bring a diverse group of people to the table. There were lots of unlikely suspects, and we brought them to the table for the intended purpose of buffering ourselves against the blowback. If we work with folks who we know are in direct opposition to the goals of this group, the most friendly of those in direct opposition, we become more familiar with what their concerns are and how to address them. So bringing unusual suspects to the table was important. The other thing that we learned in this process is to be knowledgeable and flexible about the process of change comes about. We came in with a very specific agenda, get these restroom signs changed. But in the course of that, we found out that, guess what, this can't be changed because the human rights ordinance says this. Oh, this can't be changed because the building code says this. Oh, this, and so each way throughout that process, we had to be flexible in terms of taking a left, taking a right, and still keeping the long view in place. So there was a very interesting discussion about principled versus pragmatic approaches. We are not going to move away from this idea of this is for transgendered rights versus an approach that would say this is an approach that would increase access to restroom spaces for persons with disabilities, parents of children of opposite sex, opposite genders, individuals who are caring for an older parent who may be an opposite sex. So the CRAP approach is that we are going to take the most pragmatic approach to getting this work done to benefit community. We'll fight the good fight while doing it, but we're going to take a more pragmatic approach. The other thing that we have been working on is sort of narrow myopic thinking. Part of that I just talked about. But we found that there were lots of us who were at the table, but we had shared a lot of similar ideas. And we were deciding that one of the things we need to do is to develop models of these restroom signs so that when we go doing outreach, we can give people examples. We're like, well, here's what it should look like. And then we're trying to like, wait, how do we know what it should look like? Let's involve community. And so we did, when Creating Change was in town last year, we did a survey, got 900 responses over a 3-day conference that said this question: from all over the country, which of these signs would you prefer in terms of a gender-neutral space? And we were able to use that data to inform what we were doing next. So reach out to community. Don't make assumptions based on about what people do or don't want. Okay? And to increase awareness and access, really working with the press to get out your story. So a partner was Windy City Times. And so we got interviewed. Windy City Times put out an article on this, and it just got picked up and picked up and picked up and picked up. And so there was a whole lot of buzz around the survey and what our findings were. Well, there's a fair amount of blowback too, but we'll deal with that. We also found that we needed to work with the city government, the Commission for Human Rights, the aldermen and alderwomen made it, some of the work that we needed to do was essential for that government-community relationship. Because unless we got the human rights ordinance changed, all this other work was really, was not going to be possible. And this is some result of some advocacy that the CRAP group brought, is that we got a specific change in the human rights ordinance that got away from this idea that people have to show a government-issued ID in terms of accessing restrooms. So that's no longer the law of the land in Chicago, yay CRAP. Okay. Engage key constituencies. African American folks are routinely blamed for the failures of LGBT initiatives. And there was some rumblings that we really needed to be concerned about the Black Caucus in City Council. And I'm like, we're not going to replicate some old stuff here. If we feel like the Black community needs to be engaged, let's just not sit and worry about them. Let's engage them. So now I have got pushed into research. Okay, here we go. So we're like, okay, how do we need some money for this? Let's write a small grant. IRRPP has funded this group to specifically do outreach to the African American community, to talk with 5 stakeholder groups about issues related to LGBT issues as social justice issues. And we are working on this so that when we have the data in hand, the collaborations in hand, so when it's time to go to city council, the city council can't hide behind the ministers will do X, Y, or Z. We're going to come armed with collaborators and data to show otherwise. Okay? Work with key gatekeepers. The Alderman Dow has been an unexpected, fierce ally. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Okay? So, what are the lessons that we've learned so far? It's essential to be inclusive. We're now working with architects, parent groups, women's groups. Be persistent, even when you have to jag left to get to right. Be persistent. What happens when you have community central and community really caring about the problem that you're working on, regardless of whatever happens with your other stakeholders, community stays present because we want to P and P, so we got to keep the work going. All right, that's me. I'll talk later.
Thank everybody, especially for keeping to time and for all that you've shared. Wanted now to take the rest of the time that we have, about 25 minutes, to open it up for questions. So, and I thought at this point, if we could take 3 questions at a time, and then, that way each of our panelists can address one of them. We'd love to hear from you. So anybody who's got a burning issue? Amanda.
Get things started. I'm just interested in hearing any of you as well then reflect a little bit about what does it mean if there isn't one community or like one voice in a community? What if you're trying to figure out what the story in a community is, and then there's a lot of contestation about what needs to happen or how to represent. And I was just thinking about my own experiences in schools and how often parents, teachers, there's a lot of different arguments within spaces about what needs to happen and just how you manage that in the past.
Anyone else? Yeah, Andy.
Thanks for the presentations. I thought all of them were extremely useful, informative, thought-provoking. I wanted to pick up on one aspect that came out in several presentations, which was about that moment of trying to create spaces for collaborative analysis of the data. And Jenny mentioned think tanks. I love the idea of action tank. But I'd like to, if you could talk a little bit more about kind of that aspect of it, the collaborative, community-engaged analysis.
I'd love to take a shot, if you don't mind. Or we're waiting for one more.
Anybody
Sorry.
else?
Dibs on that one.
Please.
Yeah, I just have a question about entering institutions that are oppressive to the groups that we work with, and how do we enter spaces that, or I guess, for example, thinking about like Dr. Richie's work with prisons, or I'm interested in working with nursing homes. How do we enter these spaces that we likely are not going to have quote unquote nice things to say about, due to their very nature? Like how do we get them? How do we access them in a meaningful way without, not going against our own values?
Panelists? I think that's 3 questions.
Sure, yeah. Great question. Actually, if you don't mind, I'll do a hybrid of these last 2. One of my colleagues in North Lawndale says, don't forget that you and your students are coming into neighborhoods with UIC tattooed across your forehead and what that might mean. And making sure that's not exactly talking about hostile institution, but it does speak to kind of identities and entry into partnerships. And being familiar with the history of oppression that our academic institution has played, the role that they've played in proximal neighborhoods. But just real quickly on think tanks, we basically created this model because we couldn't figure out how else to do this. In our community health assessment model, as I said, we do interviews, we do focus groups, and then with that data, we create a tailored community health survey. We collect the data in partnership with community-based organizations, and then, typically in research, that's when the academics say, thank you very much, we'll go back and tell you what the findings are. And we realize that, our partners basically said, this is the time in which we really need to be involved. So we created these spaces which basically are in a meeting format, but we mostly meet in the community where we engage in every stage of that data analysis, from the cleaning of the survey data to coming up with the research questions to the analysis plan. And it's been so valuable, so labor intensive, and takes so long, which very much impacts, of course, how a community engaged scholar might look like in terms of productivity and impact, because that manuscript takes a lot longer when it has 5 community members on it. I could go off on that, and I'm going to try not to. So Just real quickly, this happened last week, so I just want to share it. We were going through the survey data, and we were looking at the questions for which there are a high number of missing data. And one of our statisticians said, yeah, that's a high number of missing, so what we typically do, you know, is we exclude that from the analysis because there were so many missing. And someone in our think tank said, well, actually, maybe we should start looking at the items for which there are high numbers. Maybe there's a pattern there that we weren't aware of. And of course, the questions had to do with documentation status, immigrant identity, these very uncomfortable, sensitive, private questions. And we took steps back and said, you know, that we're going to have to look at those items differently, and maybe we'll need a qualitative component to this because we didn't get the data we're interested in.
Well, we've talked a little bit about the hostile institution, and you know, I don't really have a good answer. I mean, it feels like it for me. It's important, you know, to give voice to people who are entrapped in those hostile institutions, and the only way to do it that I can think of is to go in. But I do, you know, do it each time, you know, after all these years, each time with like a sense of like creepiness, you know. I don't like to go in. I feel humiliated when I go in. I feel degraded. I often assume a demeanor so that I'll be able to get in, you know, that is, you know, self-effacing. I try to comply with the rules so I don't get in trouble. I don't take a pencil. But you know, in some ways, what I realize about that is that's data. I mean, that's what I do on the day that I go. That's how people live their lives every hour of every day. And so I try to use that to sort of be, you know, reminded, humbled, thoughtful, outraged as part of it, but also, you know, just to bring that to people who need to know that that's what the condition, I mean, if that's the condition for a researcher, imagine the condition for life, right? And for some people it's life. So I don't really have I haven't figured out a better way to do it except to be in it, you know, and try to use it to motivate what I'm trying to do. And in some ways that's similar to your question, Amanda, that it's clear to me that when I think about both the Bail Project and the Hands to Hold, Room to Dance project, that's what they said, you know what, Beth, we've got hands to hold and room to dance. Don't let that little sign bother you. Tell the story of what we're really doing in Here to Survive. You know, there's more than one community in any community. And part of the point of listening to family members is all of the research, and most of it's good research, on the impact of bail looks at what happens to people who are in the system, not the collateral consequences for the rest of the community. And that's like everybody, you know, that's neighbors, employers, family members, loved ones, children. And so, you know, I think part of it is we have to say more clearly in this world of community research that there are communities, and within any community there are lots of different places, and sometimes they have competing interests, and you know, family members might feel differently than people who are caught in the system, and parents obviously are going to feel differently than children and so I think we need to sort of move back from that mythological notion of some, you know, idealized community where there's some kind of consensus about most of these things. I mean, certainly I'm sure part of what, you know, your work is pointing to that. So
yeah, so certainly, so working with city government, I mean, there are parts of that are very distasteful to some of the purest activists who are in the group. But again, we have as a value to work in a pragmatic way, but keep people's feet to the fires in places where it's appropriate and not counterproductive to the advancement of the specific goals. And again, that has led us to some very interesting and uncomfortable conversations at times. Also thinking about the pulling away from a very specific trans advocacy in this work has created lots of discomfort. But I think it's that there's a level of trust, that folks are willing to stay at the table, maintain their spaces when they walk away from the table in the places and how they need to do the work, but when we come back, say, here are the shared values, and here as a collective, here's the way that we feel best at this moment in time in terms of advancing the larger objective. We invite people to the table who were pressure test, challenge, that those working assumptions. That's what keeps us very close to the ground. So that, I think that's one of the things that is working extremely well with this collaboration.
I just wanted to speak to the question about contestation within communities, and it's a really good one. And we've been thinking about this recently. Rhoda and I have been thinking about this. This is really Rhoda's work. So we're part of organizations, and we're part of a coalition, right? And the coalition is fighting for certain things. We're fighting against a set of neoliberal policies that are very much grounded in white supremacy in the city. It's part of advancing an agenda for the city, a privatization of the city, gentrification, et cetera. And so that coalition has a clear agenda, and the organizations in it have a clear agenda. But it doesn't encompass all parents and all students in the city. And so we've been thinking about the charter school parents. And there was a recent thing that happened at the school board meeting that's we really need to think hard about. It's very painful, actually, in which folks on the southwest side who are organizing against more charter schools coming into their neighborhood, which are the charter schools come in and these shiny new charter schools, and they siphon off students, and meanwhile the neighborhood school is being disinvested in, and so it's the process of closing that school, right? So they're fighting for their school. And they're fighting against privatization. And the privatizer is not some neighborhood mom and pop. It's a charter school chain. On the other hand, there were parents at that same board meeting from the same neighborhood, working class Latino parents, who were saying, no, the neighborhood schools aren't good. We're just trying to do the best we can for our children. So actually, all the parents are trying to do the best they can for their children. And actually to build a broader education movement that envisions the kind of schools we really want to have. We need to have we need to have a broader movement that involves all of us, right? So what kind of research could we do that could help everybody in this process of trying to figure out together how to build that? So I think it's a really good question. And it's a sort of a limitation of our work because we're working within a certain coalition, and I mean, I fully 100% support and endorse the agenda of our coalition, but it doesn't speak broadly enough to where folks are at. So how can that agenda be a broader agenda? We haven't figured it out, so I don't know the end. I mean, that's something we have to figure out.
Other questions? Prudence?
Thank you all so much for your presentation. Thank you, IRRPP. I'm interested in, as activist scholars, engaged researchers, how do you use your research or your engagement to actually move policies on a legislative level, right? So how do you think about, if you think about it, your plan? How do you target a policymaker, target opposition policy? I know Phoenix, you spoke a bit about this. And then, but more
So I'm going to answer the first two questions together. I have spent a lot of years being hesitant to be a researcher at all. And, realize now in many ways, because groups have told me that that's, my obligation. And so it doesn't serve people well to act like I don't have power and privilege and that people will listen to me. And I think that's sort of the point I was making at the end, that I feel like I have an obligation both to the action work, but also to the people who have taught me what I know, to use what I know well. And I think that also includes work at the university to make sure that people's work, when it's evaluated for promotion and tenure, it counts, right? So I want to sort of step up a little bit more in that. And it's sort of, I feel like I was sort of not given permission, but demands were made on me to write policy by people, from the National Network for Women in Prison, for example. I know how to write policy. I engage with policy groups, the Sentencing Project, the Urban Institute, policy groups around the country. And so I was obligated to therefore go to those meetings, share the very specific policy ideas that they had, Prudence, not like vague ideas, but you need to stop, this will not work. Instead, this needs to happen. And use my privilege well in service to the lessons that I have been taught. And so I do more of that, either testifying, writing policy, identifying people who can speak instead of me in some instances, but sort of taking that part of my responsibility a little bit more seriously. And once I think it for me is also that the work that I'm doing is on, there's a lot of other people doing that work now. There's a lot of attention, public attention to criminal legal reform. So it's not hard to find places to articulate the things that I've learned from the people that I've worked with in those spaces. I think it's really, all of our work is kind of at different places in public consciousness and therefore in the on the minds of policymakers. So it doesn't, that to say it doesn't feel that hard in some ways an answer to your question.
And in deploying each of those, parts of those identities, activist, researcher, strategically. So over the last several years, I was doing some work with the city on menthol regulation, cigarette taxation. I needed to show up as Dr. Matthews, as an expert in smoking cessation, the role of menthol, the way in which it disproportionately impacts Black smokers. I had to bring the scientific literature to bear there, right? I did it in terms of activist goals, but I needed to show up as Dr. Matthews. When I met with Alderman Dow, I needed to show up as Phoenix. I needed to give a representation of Black transness that emphasized for her the intersectionality between racial and social justice and LGBT social justice, right? And I needed her not to be able to other the problem as something that is in the academy or in the white north side. So showing up as Phoenix was strategically deployed and I think had the necessary and the desired impact. So I think that about it, but I also think about that it is a responsibility that we have because of our privilege of understanding research to be able to speak to different audiences on behalf of the communities that we care about, to bring, to publish, to work in collaboration with community, to put down the information that we have learned through this CRAP project about how to make changes and the menthol work, how to make changes on the local level that isn't happening on the national level, and how to do that in partnership. And also for the research communities and the activist communities to be able to get some real opinion about Black opinions about LGBT and trans issues that are not informed by assumptions of homophobia or excessive transphobia, that really does talk about what the areas of agreement are, the areas of conflict, and where are the leverage points in which, so that we can go into communities and work to make change. So I think that's a part of the responsibility that we have, is to use these experiences to help further the work of both researchers and activists.
I just want to piggyback on that, and I just want to pretty much ditto what Beth said and also what Phoenix said. And I think for myself, I'm too much on the other end. I'd actually much rather be sleeping outside at night in front of the Board of Education in December than writing a policy brief, for real. Not that I like sleeping outside, but I mean, I would rather actually be in the streets than doing that. And but you know, I think we really do have to struggle with like what responsibilities we have, and how do we take the resources of the university and our own privilege, as you said, and make it useful to people. So I think some of what we've done has been, and so having done that whole disclaimer, I'll say that like around the elected representative school board campaign, which, so the bill passed the state legislature, it's before the Senate. There is a possibility that we will have an elected representative school board in Chicago. This is no big solution because the issues of the schools are structural and their policies, but it creates a much better context to fight for them. And it would be quite earth-shaking nationally, because appointed boards are a linchpin of neoliberal education reform in cities. So in the elected school board report, one of us testified before the Senate when the House, in the State House, when they were debating the bill, and that testimony was actually really important in helping to swing some of the legislators. A small group of us is meeting with Kwame Raoul, who is the Senate sponsor, and you know, his office keeps contacting me about the details of the language of the bill and stuff like that. So this is about the thing about whose knowledge do we value, because actually the language for the bill, I didn't make that up. That's a collective project that we did together. But I have to own, like, being able to leverage my position right now to actually have that conversation. I was an expert witness, so-called expert witness, for 2 lawsuits against the school closings. And you know, we spent the summer preparing the testimony for that, doing the research for that. So I just want to echo what Beth said it better than I'm saying it, but that's, I mean, we really have to sort of take responsibility for the role that we can play. It doesn't mean we can't also be activists. In fact, we have to be. But it's sort of a romantic privilege to say, well, you know, I'd rather just carry a picket sign or something like that. And so I think, you know, Prudence' question is a good one, and I could give a lot more examples. The work we did around diet that I think was really important in terms of working with the Department of Education, has pushed forward in terms of the national campaigns around school closings, and of course did have a role in the diet hunger strike, and that was more of a backseat role, but yeah.
I'll just take a shot at the last question. In participatory research and public health, there's a lot of attention on building the community's capacity to engage in research and carry on, and not enough attention to transforming research, academic institutions to be equitable partners in health equity research, or in, you know, research with a social justice bend. So I know in our research, we do a lot of emphasis of engaging community members and really trying to make research attractive and interesting, especially for communities for whom research has just been taking and oppressing for so long. But we do the same amount of kind of self-reflection on us as academics in our institution, and our need to really transform so that we can be partners, so that communities can drive research, that we don't just do community research that's based in communities or has a community advisory board giving a thumbs up, that's actually driven, because that's what's going to that's what's gonna have the outputs that are more in this social change realm, this systemic change that is needed, rather than the outputs that that Beth and I both alluded to, that in academia we really value, which is this broad dissemination in terms of manuscripts and publications, advancing ourselves, but doing nothing for the communities with whom we are concerned.
Thank you very much. You know, I see we're running out of time, so perhaps, you know, we just want to thank the panelists. Also want to thank the IRRPP staff for helping put this together. Phoenix,
Can I say one thing before we go? I really, really want to point to the work that IRRPP is doing and my experiences with Beth, Richie, in helping to inform me the ways in which I can be involved in policy and policy change. It had never occurred to me. I do research, I write the article, next. But after being involved in the work that's been happening there, and now with the transition to new and excellent leadership, it's really been a powerful tool for social change, and we're very, very fortunate to have this institute on campus. And so, you know, those of you who are doing research, are community engaged, really learn the tools and the power of policy, because it can make all the difference in people's lives.
Can I just make a comment, because we have been talking about the activists and research, but we are also teachers, and many of you, right, bring this kind of work in your classes, right, and many other people are trying to, so that's another conversation, it's an extension, and as the director of the Center for the Advancement of Teacher Learning Communities, I think we really need to be bringing in our courses, right, and helping our students think about how they're gonna do this kind of work when they come out, but also how we teach in ways that we experience this work in the moment. So that's something for us to keep the conversation going.
and we definitely, you know, want to second also what Phoenix is saying, and this conversation will keep going. We do have other policy workshops that are coming. We invite you to come and actually learn also. How do we write an op-ed? I don't know, but I'm really eager to find out how I can become more involved myself, both for my own research and actually also to be more responsive to what the community is asking us. And also to invite you to continue to both share your experiences with us, and also this is you know, a panel that's come together because essentially you guys have asked for it. And so it's something that we're responding also to what our other broader community, the university, is also asking for. So keep those channels open for us as well, and we'll keep listening to you, and hopefully you'll keep being part of our broader community. So thank you so much to the panelists. Thanks to everyone for coming.